Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, welcome back. We are returning with another panel. This one is brought to you in cooperation with Forum 2000, one of our partners, and the title, Support for Democracy Through EU External Policy, New Tools for Growing Challenges, suggests that, as it was mentioned in the opening remarks, there are multiple crises that we have been facing and we are still facing nowadays, and one of them is, unfortunately, crisis of democracy itself. The EU, the whole project has been built on the values of democracy and human rights, and how this will be tackled and how the EU will be the moderator of the dialogue on democracy will be discussed in the next panel. That's moderated by my colleague from the New Europe. He's the Energy and Russian Affairs editor. It's Mr. Kostis Geropoulos. Kostis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you all for joining us here in person and also online. We have a very interesting discussion today. We are going to discuss about the support for democracy through EU external policy, the new tools for growing challenges in the EU and the world. We have a very interesting panel, with a lot of experience. My first guest is Roberto Montella. He is the Secretary General for the OSCE. My second guest is Ken Wallach. He's the Chairman for National Endowment for Democracy. And my third guest is Vesela Tserneva, the Deputy Director of European Council for Foreign Relations and Head of ECFR Sofia. Thank you very much for participating today. In recent years, multiple crises and radical rise of nationalism and populism under various guises have been a direct challenge to global democracy, undermining post-war democratic values and international cooperation. The EU has been trying to strengthen democracy and has adopted a strategic approach for the promotion of democracy worldwide. Those tools include aid through specific values and partnerships, international relations and investment, but tied it into promotion of democracy and a strategic dialogue. I want to, without further ado, I want to pass the floor to Roberto and for the initial talk, and there will be about 3 to 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I'll talk a little bit about the EU access for the Western Balkans, which is an area where I worked for a number of years in the 90s and in the beginning of the 20th. For the past 2 decades, I think Thessaloniki 2003, the summit in Thessaloniki 2003, was the main, let's say, effective incentive, we would call it the carrot, for the entire region of the Western Balkan. I knew at that time Prime Minister Zoran Živković, who became Prime Minister after the assassination of Đinđić. And Živković, when he came back from Thessaloniki, he came back with lots of hope for Serbia, but for the entire Balkan, thinking that this summit and the promises that they got from the EU would be a kind of a driving force for the entire region. The shared EU perspective proved to be a unifying factor and probably the most important driver for the region, not least in promoting reconciliation, regional cooperation, reforms like institution building, rule of law, law enforcement, media, civil society, interactive relations, judiciary, education, and others. There's been, of course, some delays in this EU perspective for the Western Balkans and challenges. The Western Balkans, in my opinion, are entirely reliant on external factors, both economically and for their security. They need the EU, but they need other international organizations also to support them in their perspective towards, I would say, even the Euro-Atlantic community, because some of them are already in NATO. Some countries, I think of Serbia, probably they will not look into that perspective, but they're all looking at Brussels as the main perspective for the region. And I think also Brussels should step up also its commitment to the region. Despite these temporary pauses, the European Union accession process remained very high on the foreign policy agenda of the Western Balkan countries, and this has helped them slowly moving away from the challenges they had in the 90s. One of the challenges I can think of, and having worked in Kosovo and in Belgrade, I think definitely the dialogue Pristina-Belgrade is one stumbling block, because of course if you do not resolve that issue, then it's difficult for Serbia and Kosovo to move ahead in that direction. My priority must be kept on consolidating the cornerstone of democratic transition, for instance, improving good governance, rule of law, and regional stability. And of course, all those countries need, stronger rule of law, stronger law enforcement. I think what the OSCE is doing in this region is rightly targeted strengthening exactly those aspects. The OSCE has missions in Albania, in Kosovo, in Serbia, in Montenegro, in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And for years now, at least for 20 years, and for a long chunk of those years, I was myself directly involved in these activities. We've worked in trying to improve the institutions, trying to work on strengthening law enforcement agencies, trying to improve the justice system and the rule of law in those countries. All of these are fundamentals in order to then attract investment, attract all the great acquis also, and the economic power that the EU has. The EU has a lot of money, invests a lot of money in the region, but of course this money has to be invested, of course, in the strengthening of the institutions, but also in the economic development of the region. And the economic development can only come once these countries have safe and sound institutions, which will allow investors to invest in a safe environment. I think I started with that. I think the perspective also for the region is good, especially in the OSCE. We've had Albania chairing the OSCE last year, and North Macedonia will be chairing the organization in 2023. So there is a kind of a perspective also within the OSCE for the region, which I am quite optimistic for. I think we'll leave it at that. It would be very interesting maybe to have some Q&A and answer to those who have some questions.
Yeah, definitely. And I have some questions myself. Before we proceed, I wanted to ask you about we have a poll also, which is, do you see the EU as a powerful player in external policy while it advocates value-based economic relations? Yes or no? We'll take your vote, and then at the end, we'll announce the winner at the end of the panel. Before I move into you, I just picking up what from Roberto said. Roberto, when you said that about economic incentives, do you mean like kind of like a carrot and stick kind of situation where in terms of, because some of the countries, let's face it, have done a lot in promoting democracy, but some are kind of like further away back. So is this kind of approach, like kind of give them some incentives for?
I think so. The carrot and stick policy has worked in the Balkans. I think one of the approaches that we introduced with the OSCE was that of not patronizing those countries. It's very important also to be aware of how proud people are in the region. Mm-hmm. So with the OSCE there, we've tried to work together with the governments rather than coming from Brussels or coming from European capitals and trying to tell them, look, this is the acquis, this is the 10 things that you need to do in order to become then a florid democracy, but kind of working together with them and also trying to understand their timings, trying to be aware of their own mentalities, they will say in all the countries of the Balkans where I've worked, they will say, no, but we are very specific. And I think they are very specific. And so I think the international community should also have that kind of soft skill to understand the peculiarities of the countries where we operate, be respectful of the realities, not be impatient. And normally, you know, we are, when you come from the international community, we're a bit impatient. We would like them to get their act together, and then you know, we can invest money. But I think we should work hand in hand with those countries, understanding their peculiarities, and kind of work together with them towards a path of more good governance and strengthened democracy.
Thanks, Roberto. Ken, I'm going to move over to you. You have a lot, I mean, as the chairman of the National Endowment for Democracy, and now we see that President Biden is working with the EU in terms of promoting democracy and values back in the world. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kostas. And I was going to ask Roberto who he was supporting in yesterday's football match, but I think it was rather obvious. I think over the past 4 decades, we made a number of assumptions about democratic development, some of which were correct even in the face of skeptics and scholars who argue that most places in the world were not fertile territory for democracy, whether in South America because of the hierarchy of the church, in Asia because of the influence of Confucianism, or in Africa because of tribalism or the lack of a middle class. Yeah. But freedom and democracy, particularly in a growing, interdependent and interconnected world, proved to be universal aspirations. And these sentiments have been borne out by public opinion research, by observation, and by citizens' demand for political voice, whether it's from Sudan to Slovakia, Armenia to Algeria. And these demands for political voice emerged in all cultures and under all socioeconomic conditions. And there was also an understanding in the traditional development community of the linkage between human development and democracy. I remember the landmark 2000 UNDP Human Development Report, which concluded that democracy was not only the end of human development, but the best means to achieve human development. And also, I recollect the Swedish development policy, which concluded that you can measure poverty not only in socioeconomic terms, but in political terms, that if people do not have a political voice, they are poor. But I would say over the past 4 decades, we were not as prescient about 3 interrelated challenges. The first was the sustaining of democratic systems in so-called new democracies. And the second was the darker side of the internet and social media. And the third is the so-called authoritarian learning. The once rapid pace of democratic change had led many of us to hope, if not expect, that democratic progress would be more linear. As Bronislaw Geremek, the late Polish historian, Solidarity leader, and foreign minister warned, democracy is by no means a process that goes from triumph to triumph, nor is it exempt from creating the very conditions that undermine it. And it was Hugo Chavez who once quipped that he was the result, not the cause. In Venezuela, like in other places, democracies beset by corruption or unresponsive institutions led to the rise of populist leaders who were able to tap into citizen discontent and fears. Second, we underestimated the resiliency of autocratic regimes, which have deployed traditional and new methods to arrogate power to themselves and to stifle dissent. And these regimes now communicate with and learn from each other. And third, we now know that the initial views about the impact of technological change were incomplete. Many had presented a cyber utopian view of the impact of the internet on democracy whereby increased internet access would inevitably lead to more open societies. This has now given way to a more realistic, if not darker view. As Wael Ghonim, the democratic activist whose Facebook post helped ignite the Egyptian revolution, now warns, social media was once seen as a liberating means to speak truth to power. Now the issue is how to speak truth to social media. I will conclude by just saying that the challenges to democracy, whether in the disinformation space, poor government, corruption, the crisis of political parties, migration, in this interdependent world, do not lend themselves to unilateral action. They require a collective response because the challenges cross borders and they cross regions. And I think now is the time to have serious initiatives between the United States and Europe to not necessarily coordinate all activities, but to communicate more regularly at a high level, as is done in the development sphere, and to find out if there are cooperative efforts on the ground that can be carried out to address these challenges that require, as I said, a collective response. So thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Priscilla, before I move into you, I want to just pick up a little bit on what Ken just said about, cooperation between the US and the EU. I mean, we've seen that in the US, in the previous presidency, kind of human rights and values of democracy values have been on the back burner. So does now we need like an increased effort, and how can we build this cooperation, and what other players can also help in terms of creating like a front where, promoting democracy and tackling all those changes, and especially the problem of disinformation, which seems now that it's kind of spiraling authoritarianism and populist voices.
Well, I'll just begin on the disinformation. I think to battle disinformation, because you cannot respond to a fire hose of disinformation with a squirt gun of truth. You require a whole of society approach to this challenge. So the international community, and particularly Europe and the United States, must respond collectively as well. 40 years ago, there was no democracy architecture in the world. The only institutions that were engaged in this work were the German party foundations that played such an important role in Spain and Portugal in the 1970s. Today, there is a democracy architecture that includes intergovernmental organizations, donor aid agencies, civil society networks, political party networks. And I think the challenge is, how do you strengthen these institutions, whether they're governmental or non-governmental? There have been high-level dialogues between the United States and Europe on development strategy. There has not been a similar high-level dialogue on democracy promotion and the roles that Europe and the United States can play. I think it's time, given these challenges, to have a democracy stimulus. It's not a time for retreat. And it requires sort of a new call to action in terms of conversations, cooperations, and ultimately coordination if it can be achieved.
Thanks, Ken. Priscilla, I understand that, also, you also know very well, like Roberto, the Balkans, and also that, you have focused on the tools that for tackling corruption and needing to support an independent media, which, from what Ken said, is also a very important tool in terms of tackling disinformation and so forth. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. If you allow me, I will zoom out a little bit. There is an echo, by the way. If the technicians can cope with it, that would be great. I will start from the end of the Trump administration and the fact that Europeans were quite skeptical, obviously, during the last days of Trump, that there will be a big change even if Biden would win. And we did a public opinion poll across Europe, and it turns out that currently, still, the majority of Europeans is, of course, enthusiastic about the change in the White House, but they are not sure whether we would not see a repetition of the Trump phenomenon in 3.5 years or the term after. And so I'm saying this because our understanding of democracy promotion has changed. And what democracy support means these days is not what it meant in the 90s. In addition to that was obviously the COVID crisis. COVID triggered skepticism in some EU member states, not only about the transatlantic alliance, but also about the nature of the European project. And our latest survey shows that 49% of the Germans have less confidence in the EU throughout the COVID crisis. And I think this is a very significant finding given the role that Germany plays for the European integration project. And against this background, I think it's even more needed to have a joint effort, a joint push for rebuilding trust in democracy and in the democratic architecture, as Ken Wallach just put it. There are several ways how to do this, and I said I would talk briefly about the anti-corruption tools and the media freedom policies. And you can ask me why in the Balkans, which I, like Roberto, know best, it seems that these are two ways through which, or two channels for really for deterioration of the democratic order. Roberto quoted Zoran Djindjic. Unfortunately, if we think about Serbia at the times of Djindjic and we think about Serbia today, the picture is not rosy, to say the least. A survey that we did in Serbia, and we have not published yet, but I can share with you at least one of the figures. We asked Serbs how they see Russia and how they see China. And over half of them, 54%, say that Russia is an ally, and additional 41% say it's a necessary partner. And these are altogether 95%. The situation on China is not much better. Around 90% altogether see China in a positive light. And I think this is not because the EU has not tried to help, especially now there is also help in terms of vaccines, but also financial help and so on. And yet we see this huge, what should I say, lack of trust. This is mainly, I think, through media, through mainstream media, but also through the lack of soft skills in the citizens about and understanding this complex environment in which we live. And for the EU, developing a media support tool, which would be even, it does not necessarily need to be within the acquis. It can be also a special tool aimed at the quality of media in the countries, in the region, would make a very big difference. Obviously, it would be great if that could be applied also within the EU itself, which probably will be slightly more difficult, but we can talk about it in the Q&A. My point on corruption, there was a White House executive order which came out maybe a month ago, which was stating that the US would trigger the Magnitsky Act for grave mismanagement, corruption by leaders in the Western Balkans. And I thought that this was a very important sign, also telling to Europeans that corruption indeed can be a great hurdle for democracies in the region and beyond. And so how the EU is going to respond to that, I think, is also a very, very important question. My last point, which are our role models? And I think this is maybe how all of that discussion ties together. There will be a big battle within the EU, but I think also globally, between liberal democracies and illiberal democracies, or authoritarian regimes. This battle has not happened yet. I mean, the outcome is still to be seen. It's not going to be an easy one, but this is extremely important for the future of democracy work beyond the borders of EU and the US. And I think there needs to be also a joint effort in stating things right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Marcela. Actually, I'll jump really quick to a question from the audience because it kind of touches. It's not directly to you, but it mentions the the soft power influence from it be Russia or China or somebody else. And the question is, what particular measures should the EU adopt to reverse democratic backsliding in the Balkan Six and to counter this foreign soft power influence in these countries?
We lost you.
It was asking what particular measures should the EU adopt to reverse democratic backsliding in the Balkan Six and counter foreign soft power influence from Russia and China.
I gave my 2 cents on corruption and media. I think beyond that, it's basically the task of the nations themselves. It's a choice that one needs to make. And as Roberto said at the beginning, this is a choice that cannot be made by others. These are important decisions. And frankly, if Mr. Vučić feels that he has to proclaim his friendship with China and Russia, and this is going to bring better future for his people, it's his sovereign right to do so. And then in this case, the EU will have to, make up our minds, how we're going to treat that particular candidate country.
Roberto, you're nodding. I mean, do you have anything to add?
I couldn't agree more with Anna Palacio. I think the biggest responsibility really lies into the governments, into the leadership of the countries. I think the international community, the EU in particular, is investing a lot of money. The international community, the OSCE, I would say to some extent in the early 90s, also the US have played an important role. We've invested a lot of money. We've invested also in hard security. So there is not a lack of interest from an economic and a political aspect from the international community. There's a lot of homework to be done also internally by the leadership. And I think, if you allow me, I would say that there is a lot of exercise to do on the mentality change, I would call it, a mentality change, and I hope that the new generations will bring this mentality change. I've lived in the Balkans for many years, especially in Belgrade, but also in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Kosovo, in Montenegro, and there is a little bit this attitude of what I call intellectual arrogance, this idea of thinking, well, we know best, we are the smartest. Those who come from outside, they're not as smart as we are. I come from southern Italy, so I know exactly that type of mentality, and I very much resent that type of mentality, because I've always looked at other countries doing well, but in southern Italy we think, okay, we are the smartest, we are the ones who can trick or can. You've seen, Kenneth mentioned who I was cheering for yesterday. Yes, of course I was cheering for Italy. But I was cheering for Italy who has changed its mentality in playing football, not a speculative football, not a type of football that tries to use tricks or tries to use defensive, but more, propositive and more changing its mentality, trying to actually do what Spain does in football. So if you allow me this parallel, I would say a change of mentality in the Balkans that goes away from the idea of thinking, well, we are the best, we are the most clever, and trying to look at other examples in Europe and trying to learn from those examples, and also maybe do a little exercise of humility sometimes, and also appreciation for the help that comes from the international community. Sorry if I'm too harsh, but I think one has to say those things.
Definitely.
I don't want to appear presumptuous, but I'm not a diplomat, and I'll try to be as direct as I can. I think there are a few things that the Europeans can do in this regard in the Balkans. First of all, I think for the United States, we can't leave the playing field to the Europeans alone. And I think there's been a tendency over the last decade or so for the United States to withdraw from the Balkans and leave it to the Europeans to handle these challenges. So that's the first. Second of all, I think it's very important for the European project, the European Commission, to streamline its democracy, streamline its bureaucracy in this regard. You know, right now there is a democracy bureaucracy in the Commission. I remember a former Prime Minister of Bosnia who told me, commenting on the international community in general, but the Europeans in particular, that the comment was always, what can we do for you next year? Thirdly, I think it's important to focus in on political party reform. I think it's the failures of political parties to reform and respond, both outside government and inside government, that has created, in part, a crisis of confidence in political institutions. Finally, I think it would be important for the European project, including the OSCE, to revisit the notion that it should decide everything by consensus. And I think in many of these places, even though humility, I think, is important, I think some tough love is going to be needed in some of these places if these countries are going to be part of the European project. So I think it's a combination of all of these things: greater activism, the politicization, in the best sense of the word, of democracy assistance, and a streamlining of democracy to make the assistance more responsive, more relevant, and more timely.
Thank you, Ken. There's a question actually addressed to you about if, in terms of if, like in the US, if, for example, lobbying was more, allowed more effectively in Europe, if, that it would also, be more easier to tackle corruption and also, being enhance democratic values and the belief in democracy.
I would agree with that. I mean, providing greater avenues for accountability and citizen engagement, I think, is very important. Our systems, however, are quite different. We are not party-based system. We're not a party-based system in the United States. And therefore, individual members of Congress are responsive to their constituencies by and large. And that's how the system was created. It's much more difficult in a parliamentary system to have the same avenues for citizen engagement as there is in the United States. But if there is consideration of structural changes that are needed, I think that would be something to consider. I think, however, there are downsides to greater lobbyists, and the question is who has the greatest access. If money drives the process, if people can monetize their government service in the lobbying sphere, how do you have a control system and guardrails to avoid abuses in the lobbying effort? But certainly the notion of providing greater access to citizens and influence to civil society, I think, is important. And the media will play an important role in this as well, in terms of exposing corruption. But this is something the United States and Europe has to do in tandem. It can't be done unilaterally.
What lessons have we learned from the early 2000s and the support of democracy, and those takes away we can make the mistakes that led to the increasingly rise of authoritarianism and the anti-democratic forces versus, for example, from the early 2000s, from experience from Spain, for example. What kind of experiences can we get in terms of what went wrong, and we have this rise of undemocratic values? Anne? You want to take the floor?
Who is the question to? Sorry?
To you.
To me.
Yeah.
Well, I think that I don't know about Spain, because this is obviously not a country I know very well. Maybe this was a question to Ana Palacio, who is not here. But in terms of the Balkans...
Yeah, I know. I realize for some reason, because that's why I was asking about the experience for Spain from early 2000. I mean, what kind of lessons we've learned from in this case?
Yeah, that's why I was saying it was probably for Ana. Is Ana here? No.
No.
Okay.
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 No, I got it. Okay, yeah. Okay.
I can plead guilty there. I must have confused the moderator, because when I thanked you, I said so probably I have misled the moderator.
Okay.
That's okay, but if I can at least get a bit of a perspective from southeastern Europe, maybe not southwestern Europe. Compared to the 90s, our democracies have gone in a bit of a circle. We have started off with a lot of enthusiasm. We have went through a phase of, I think, economic integration and approximation, and we were catching up very quickly. And all of a sudden, it turned out that our societies were not ready to be, to be part of the same community of values in every respect. So if you think about Mr. Orban with his anti-LGBT law currently, or about Mr. Kaczynski with the idea of changing a bit the separation of powers and the independence of judiciary, but also with the captured states across the region, with the very dire media situation. I think Mr. Geremik and others probably would not be very happy if they could see that today. And I think the question is, what can we do to change the course of democracies in our part of Europe, which used to be seen as kind of the model transition, maybe after Spain. And so I think this is the big. This is going to be the big issue for the next 10 years for the EU. What kind of instruments can the EU develop in order to make, after having made the economy gap much smaller, how can it make the democracy gap smaller? And I totally agree with Ken Wallach. It's about working with political parties. It's about making politicians understand that representing a constituency is as important as representing also economic interest and so on. And that democracy is a long-term game. It goes beyond the 4 years of one's election cycle.
Ken, I wanted to ask you, what do you see aside from the use of digital platforms and basically the grassroots levels from person to person or through disinformation that is driving people either to the far left or the far right, because both sides are a side of authoritarianism? And what can, as you know, from your experience drawing from the US, what can the EU do to bring the measured, middle ground back into relevancy in terms of appealing to all these countries and to people, and tackle the problem of populism and nationalism, which seems to be growing in certain parts of EU's borders, but also within some EU countries. I mean, we've seen the example, for example, from Hungary and Poland. So what do you think can do, aside from digital platforms, to address this problem of disinformation?
Well, I think that there are many theories on how to combat disinformation and information manipulation. There is disruption tactics, including regulating social media platforms, establishing norms and standards for online behavior, and blocking content for platforms. Secondly, there's exposure, which includes verification systems, such as fact-checking and counter-messaging campaigns. There is competition, which usually involves government or corporate communication efforts aimed at countering disinformation narratives. And at the same time, support for independent media, both online and offline, particularly at a time when the business side of independent media is suffering greatly and is under great threat. Finally, research is needed to identify vulnerable populations to disinformation and determine what information and from what source is most effective in countering falsehoods. Information environments are different from country to country and sometimes from community to community, and they evolve over time. So the response must constantly adapt. One thing is clear, however, that there is no silver bullet for this phenomenon. All of these approaches must come into play because it is not enough to fight bite for bite. Disinformation is cheap and ubiquitous. It would be like, as I said earlier, fighting a fire hose of disinformation with a squirt gun of truth. Ultimately, a whole of society approach is needed in countries under attack, backed up by international networks for development of norms and standards, advocacy, peer learning, and support. These global networks, like many of their local counterparts, include governments, intergovernmental organizations, journalists, educators, religious, labor, and business leaders, political parties, parliaments, and civil society groups of all stripes.
There's a question from Sandra Brozova. I think it's not addressed to anyone particular, but I think maybe, Roberto, you can take that. It's what financial and budgetary consequences of future EU enlargement, Albania, North Macedonia membership can we expect with regard to CAP, RRF, and cohesion?
That's a challenging question for me. I am not familiar with the EU economic incentives for the region, but I am definitely an advocate of EU enlargement for those countries you've mentioned. I think the perspective has to be very clear, and I think efforts have been made, especially in those countries, to respond to the perplexities that were in few capitals, I'd say, in Europe, and I think the carrot, let's say, should come closer to those countries. I don't think there are huge financial consequences for Europe. I mean, the EU has recently passed an incredible COVID compact of an amount of resources of course, for Europe. So I don't think economic is really the problem here. Is I think more a stepping up politically and looking at this region as a region that has to be integrated in Europe. Otherwise, there will be other players on the international scene who will fill that vacuum. You've mentioned some. I know the role of China, the role of Turkey in the region, the role of Russia. So I don't think it's a wise idea to leave the Southeastern Europe countries with a very, very long-term perspective to access the EU. especially considering the amount of efforts that has been done since the 90s in the region. So to be consistent with that effort, and of course to be matched with, as I said before, a more strengthened role of leadership in those countries and a more mature posture. But I think we need to step up also the EU engagement in the region. Kenneth, I just wanted to add something, digressing from this question, on the US role in the region. Last year participated, 2 years ago, I participated at the National Prayer Breakfast, and there was a panel in Washington with congressmen on Southeast Europe with the Southeast Europe leaders. And there I said that I did, of course, miss the strong role that the US had at the region at the beginning of the 90s in Southeast Europe, because with the US in the room, you could say, I mean, when I call it the adult in the room, you would say that we do mean business. And I think some countries in Western Balkans, they do appreciate the role of the US. And I know there are lots of other theaters in the world where the US attention is distracted. There's been the fight against international terrorism in the last years, and more attention to the Pacific. So I know that the US also is looking more inwardly, or was looking more inwardly during the presidency of Trump. Now the situation is changing. But I think the US should not shy away from its role in Southeast Europe, because it's also, let's say, standing in terms of involving more civil society, and its values are very much something that the younger generation in Southeast Europe look up at.
I want to ask you, I will start with Marcela, about the COVID crisis. I mean, do you think that the tackling of the crisis in different countries can, and or lack thereof, can create this kind of, nationalism? I mean, we've seen it even with the vaccination efforts in different countries, and which vaccine they would pick, whether it's, and is this like fertile ground for like human rights abuses or lack of democracy? Because it depends also how people perceive it as well. Thanks.
Thank you. I think this is a.
Go ahead, and then Ken can. Yeah, Marcela, go ahead.
Okay, I think in the countries where governments don't enjoy big support, all the measures, the COVID measures, have been experienced by population as oppression of sorts. And we saw quite a lot of that also in public opinion polling, the sense of unfreedom, having too many limitations. Countries, however, which trusted their government, they were very supportive for all the restrictive measures for a very long time. I started by quoting Germany during the first round, because there we saw very high support for all the measures, but also the moment the vaccination efforts started to slow down, which was objectively basically driven by the lack of vaccines or the limitations on vaccine production. People would say, we produce those vaccines and they're spread elsewhere, they're given out elsewhere. The EU is not doing its job well. Mm-hmm. And this was the moment when I think a lot of skepticism started rising. At the same time, in Italy, for instance, where at the beginning Italians were extremely critical of the EU response vis-a-vis Italy's very hard-hit regions, the support for the EU started rising in the past months, especially after the recovery plan was enacted. And if you want to talk about the Balkans, I think there the biggest challenge has been the so-called vaccine diplomacy, whereby Serbia kind of turned its multipolarity into a multi-vaccine effort, and we saw all possible vaccines on offer there, which actually was a good service to the people, because whoever wanted to be vaccinated got the vaccine, and even people from around the region did that. It's another issue what this was motivated by, but we can maybe discuss it in another conversation.
Ken, you wanted to say something?
Just one word. I think that COVID has affected equally democratic regimes and more illiberal democracies or authoritarian regimes as well. If you look at the unprecedented demonstrations in Cuba today, if you look at the challenges to Bolsonaro, you will find that both of those regimes are suffering greatly from their lack of responsiveness on COVID. I think the single most important democracy assistance tool that can be used today by both the United States and Europe is to get the vaccines in the hands of citizens globally. In Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, if there can be a coordinated effort by the United States and Europe to counter, it's the single most important tool to counter Russian and Chinese influence in these countries. It's the ability of democratic governments to deliver on the vaccine.
Roberto, you had something to add on this, on the how the countries are dealing with COVID and on this issue, yeah?
Nothing more than what my previous colleagues have said, just that by personal experience, I have many friends in the region, and some have taken flights from Albania to go to Serbia and could choose a la carte whether if they were Yugo nostalgic, they would take Sputnik. If they were more American oriented, they would take Pfizer. I mean, it was like you could choose according to where politically you stood, which vaccine. That was an interesting tool, as you say, of soft, pressure, but very interesting. No, nothing to add on this.
Okay, great. There are a lot more questions online, but I want to, go the old-fashioned way also, and ask the audience to see if there are any questions from the audience. The support for democracy through the EU's external policy. Are there any questions? I can't see very well. Okay, go ahead. Just please state your name just briefly in the question. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Juuso Järviniemi from FELF. I need to disappoint you because the question is the same, which was already on the chat, but it is about the Visegrad perspective on the Western Balkans. The Visegrad countries seem to take quite a great interest in the Western Balkans. We've seen that the Hungarian government has promoted Serbia's EU accession quite forcefully in recent days. And of course, the Commissioner for Enlargement and EMP comes from Hungary as well. So I wanted to ask for your opinions on how Visegrad 4 countries could support reforms in the Western Balkans. Is there any possibility for this, considering that they support enlargement, but of course enlargement cannot come without reforms?
Is there a particular person you're directing your question to?
Nothing specific.
Anybody wants to jump in and see on his questions? Did you hear it okay?
Maybe I can try. I think I heard the second part of it. But I heard the question being about what Visegrad countries can do for the integration of the region. Look, Mr. Orban is extremely active, has been active for many years now. He was active also with the previous Macedonian leadership, the one that was said to have been part of a captured state. And this is a quote from the European Commission report, progress report. We saw Mr. Gruevski then fleeing his country and ending up in Budapest. Ever since, I think the policy of Mr. Orban in the region has been seen with a bit of a let's say, with a pinch of salt. And many people feel and fear that there can be a role model there that is not probably the best for the region. Vis-a-vis media, vis-a-vis academic independence, vis-a-vis political opponents, vis-a-vis rule of law. And this also spills over onto the enlargement commissioner, who actually very recently really tried to also introduce a 9 billion euro package, investment package for the Balkans. I think if we start looking at the region's integration through the economic perspective only, and we forget the democracy aspect, this will be a great mistake because we can see further backsliding. And as we know, those things always go hand in hand, unless we want to go down the Chinese route, of course, which I hope the Balkans don't.
We have 5 more minutes before we wrap this up. And also, are there any more questions from the audience? Then I'll take one from online. It's from Vladimir Handy from Charles University. Is there a political will in the region to deal with the culture and religious divisions, or rather a tendency, and how can we avoid from the misuse of that? I guess which can lead to, the suppression of democratic values and human rights issues. Is anybody who wants to, I don't know, Marcella, if you want to continue with this as well, with this question about how religious divisions can play a role in, in this area of the world.
There are a lot of divisions on ethnic grounds, on religious grounds, on identity grounds. And I really feel that there has been a rebirth of those divisions. And this was the moment when European perspective started becoming a bit weaker. The enlargement was frozen several times. And I hope really that we will see lifting of the Bulgarian veto on North Macedonia and Albania, and those 2 countries can start real negotiations. But the fact of the matter is that for many in the region, the European perspective is a faraway goal, if at all. And so what remains to play with, so to say, if you are a politician who doesn't want to engage in painful reforms, it is nationalisms and ethnic divisions and religious divisions. We saw this on several occasions. The role of the Orthodox churches, for instance, the Serb Orthodox Church in Montenegro. There is a Serbia-Kosovo issue, which is also very important. A Croatian-Bosnian issue because of their electoral code, which is also based on ethnicity and so on. We also saw a non-paper redrawing again the map of the Balkans along ethnic and religious lines. And I really thought that this was something we should have forgotten about 20 years ago. And unfortunately, the rebirth of those divisions is a big task that the EU, together with the US, have to start tackling again. And it feels a bit like a deja vu, but I guess this is the daily work of a democracy worker. And we should not shy away from it.
Costas, if I could,
please
respond.
Definitely.
I would like to put the issue of religious tolerance in a larger context, and it relates to the issue of disinformation that we talked about earlier. Today's disinformation employs some of the same basic ideas that we remember from the darkest chapters of human history. If you strip away the speed and the reach of social media platforms and the sophistication of modern targeting methods, and you are left with a chillingly familiar story. At a time of rapid social and economic change and growing inequality, disinformation is used to sow fear, mistrust, anger, and hatred. And so therefore, in pursuit of short-term political and commercial gain, that hatred is directed against whichever groups are most easily dehumanized. And this can be gender, language, age, sexual identity. It can be religious minorities. And rather than intolerance being the problem, the notion of diversity becomes the problem. And not all disinformation contains hate speech, and not all hate speech is based on disinformation, but there are large overlaps, particularly in terms of their goals. And these goals pose a systemic threat to democracy and to religious freedom.
And on that note, it's actually hit the mark. It's 5 o'clock, so we're running out of time. I want to thank my guests, Roberto Montella, Kenneth Wallach, and of course, Vesela Cherneva. And please stay with us. And I want to thank once again the organizers, and thanks for the online audience and people here who attended this interesting discussion.